Welcome. This is Alexia Hudson-Ward, the editor-in-chief of Toward Inclusive Excellence, or TIE for short, a multimedia blog hosted by Choice, a publishing unit of the Association of College and Research Libraries, a division of the American Library Association. We explore equity, diversity, inclusion, and accessibility issues that affect the higher education community. Among the goals of this channel is the development of a pool of knowledge and actionable resources for information professionals, undergraduates, faculty of all disciplines, campus staff, and administrators at every level seeking to understand racism and discrimination from new perspectives and to promote social justice on their campuses and within their communities. We are excited to welcome you to our podcast series that borrows its name from the higher education academic calendar. Therefore, you are listening to TIE's Spring Semester. Our second spring semester podcast features an interesting interview with Dr. Michelle Duffy. Dr. Duffy is the Vernon Heath Chair in the Department of Work and Organizations in the Carlson School of Management at the University of Minnesota. She has a PhD in Organizational Behavior and Human Resource Management from the University of Arkansas and a master's in psychology from Xavier University. Her research focuses on the ways in which employee emotions and affect influences organizational outcomes, the antecedents and consequences of antisocial behavior at work, and the role of micro-interventions in improving employee well-being and organizational life. Her current projects include a focus on resume fraud, employee envy, effective balance, and mindfulness. She is the associate editor for the Journal of Applied Psychology and a former associate editor of the Journal of Management. Her work has been published in journals such as the Journal of Applied Psychology, the Academy of Management Journal, Organizational Behavior and Human Decision Processes, and Personnel Psychology. She received the Herbie Award for Excellence in Teaching in 2007 and the Carlson School of Management Award for Service in 2011. She became an SIOP and APA Fellow in 2012 and served as the PhD Program Coordinator for the Department of Work and Organizations until 2016. Professor Duffy teaches a range of courses at Carlson, including negotiations, organizational behavior, leading others, and organizational behavior for executives. During our conversation, we discussed the vital role micro-interventions play in positive workplace engagements and how team members at every level must play a role in ensuring healthy workplace practices. In the midst of our conversation, Dr. Duffy's cat unexpectedly joins us and begins touting his human mom's insights. It was quite evident to us that he is very proud of her. Now to our conversation with Dr. Michelle Duffy. Dr. Duffy, thank you so much for joining us today. We really appreciate it.
Thank you for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Absolutely. I find your research focus on the role of micro-interventions in improving employee well-being and organizational life intriguing. So would you discuss with our audience what a micro-intervention is and what insights have you determined about their positive impact within the workplace?
Sure. So I like to think about micro interventions as short exercises that people can do at work or before work or after work. We want them to be kind of bite-sized or micro. We want them to be relevant to the person so that they want to do it, or relevant to the context they're in. And then we want them to be accessible in some way so that people keep doing them. And so, kind of in contrast to thinking if I want to make a change in myself, or if I want as a leader to see changes in my workplace, that, I maybe it doesn't have to be a major training program or a year long set of exercises. What if we can change behavior or change attitudes and outcomes with something really tiny that people can do in a few minutes each day?
Mm-hmm.
So
Mm-hmm.
that's how I like to think about the micro interventions in those different ways.
Hmm. Yeah, thank you. Because it sounds as if so much of your research identifies microaggressions as like one of several organizational impact levers, if you will, that managers can, in essence, deploy to improve workplace engagement. Is there a natural connection between successfully leveraging micro interventions with incorporating mindfulness at work?
I think there is, if I'm understanding kind of where you're going with this. So mindfulness and meditation, these micro interventions, they're small. You can do something like think about three good things for yourself. You can meditate on loving kindness. You could do a walking meditation. So there are, so many, I could just go on and on of accessible mindfulness practices that can be really relevant to any context in the workplace.
Mm-hmm.
And we know that they have a really big impact. So, like all micro interventions, there's a I would call it almost a disproportionate impact, like that you could do something 3 minutes a day and find yourself having more energy, less abusive supervision, less depletion. And that's powerful. And then in mindfulness, we see pretty strong effects of mindfulness interventions in many forms, even in something like 4 minutes a day. We don't have to do a big sit on a pillow and meditate. It can be tiny and really specific to the context.
Mm, mm-hmm. 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 And I'm really thinking about, and this is really wonderful context, I'm thinking about how managers could encourage or support these types of micro interventions. And so, can you think of some examples or provide some suggestions on, if I'm a manager that wants to pivot the conversation and practices within my organization away from microaggressions to more positive micro interactions, what are some of the strategies or things that I could deploy in order for that to happen effectively?
Effectively.
Yeah.
So I think I have a pretty long-winded answer here. So,
Oh, great. Good.
okay. um, because it's such an important issue, and I think there are, I would call them things like that we should probably stop doing first, and then things that we can start doing. So, if I'm kind of backing up to thinking about with the microaggressions and negative micro engagements, I think a really basic thing that may sound obvious, but I think sometimes it's not for people, is that we have to stop minimizing that they're happening.
Mm-hmm.
And I do find that, and many of us probably, probably myself included, have had at times the temptation to say, oh, that's just an individual problem. Oh, that's just a personal problem. And they're not. And we need to stop saying, like, this is your problem, or this is a personal problem, or this is a relationship problem. So these kind of negative engagements are not things we should normalize in the workplace. We shouldn't allow them
Mm-hmm.
to fester by normalizing them. And so, and then I think if we can get to that point of really taking the impact of these kind of behaviors seriously, which I think actually can be a pretty big step for some places,
Mm-hmm.
I think there are things that managers, leaders, supervisors can do, broadly and small. So, one thing I like to talk about is starting really simply with asking ourselves, like, what is the way that we hear people? And what are the ways that we
Mm.
don't? And in what ways are we not hearing people talk?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
And that
Mm-hmm.
kind of that goes back to, I mean, in some ways it's very just related to what I've said, but and just in my own research, but also in many others, I think I've seen definitely positive listening. I mean, absolutely for sure. But I've also seen people that simply either won't hear another person's experience or see it or believe it because it didn't happen to them. And so, they may
Mm-hmm.
not say anything negative or they may not be actively destructive, but you can't fix this problem if you're not willing to hear from the people that are experiencing different aggressions at work. And
Right.
then,
Yep.
right. And so you need to like be thinking, okay, this may be not my experience, but I need to hear what they're saying, not assume because I didn't have it, then somehow I know better. Or another thing we do, I think that people are trying to be kind, but they might, I don't know if I'm assigning a motive that's not appropriate, but I do hear people saying things like, oh, these people are jerks to everybody.
Yes.
Or, right?
Yes. Oh
Like,
my gosh. Yes.
yeah,
Yes.
so that, and I'm sure that maybe they're trying to make the person feel better, but instead they're just not hearing their experience and the pain it's causing as if it's, well, then it's okay, right? So that's fine then because it's everybody. So those are two things. I mean, I think that is actually, I think that's pretty hard work. And to be thinking, okay, how am I hearing people and how am I not as a leader? And then, another way I think about it is what, as a leader, or actually just anybody in a workplace, what do you think is driving these kind of negative interactions? And there are a lot of different drivers, but, and for different people, there may be different pushes for them to act this way. But I think we can kind of put them in, a different, in kind of a bucket of context that is kind of helpful to think about.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
So,
Mm-hmm.
one thing is like before we even get into individuals, what is going on in your workplace climate? And so we want people to be able to feel safe speaking up against microaggressions and negative micro interactions.
Mm-hmm.
And we know that bystanders see these and that a lot of times they don't speak up, they don't know what to do, or they're afraid of repercussions if they do. And
Mm-hmm.
those don't even have to be big repercussions. So somebody could say, oh, well, in our workplace, we would never fire somebody or we would never penalize them. But there are other ways you can penalize people that even as adults, we want validation, we want connection, we don't want to be ostracized. And if you have a climate that's not very safe for people to openly speak, I think that's one thing to think about. What is my climate communicating to people? Is this a place where people could even push back on these
Right.
behaviors and voice? And then another kind of more broad thing is just, I always encourage people to think about, okay, kind of like what are your policies in the organization? What are
Mm-hmm.
your norms? And because we know these things trickle down, like people don't just live in a vacuum. And so, and I think that, people don't necessarily even think about, I think some, well, anyway, I'm gonna kind of opinionize and I'm not going to, but like, let me give you like, well, can I give this, I'll give this example.
Yeah,
I was,
please. No, please go right ahead.
um, I was asked to, as part of kind of a team building and to have student engagement with like MBA students, to join faculty and students in a football stadium. And the students would line up on either side. And then I'm like a 53-year-old woman, and maybe then I was 50, but whatever. And I was asked to
Mm-hmm.
run kind of through these lines of students while they cheered and kind of patted me. And
Oh.
I felt really I felt really uncomfortable. I felt really awkward. And I thought about other people and who would have been in this cohort who are like even older than I am, maybe have some physical disabilities.
Yeah.
and what that meant for them to have to do this. And the organizers, I don't think it wasn't negative intent. It was just they didn't think beyond
Mm-hmm.
we are young people and men, and so we're comfortable, and this is kind of fun, right? So it's things like that. I think that can communicate who is valued and who's not, even if it's subtle.
Mm-hmm.
Or
Mm-hmm.
maybe you have a faculty workshop or a staff workshop with lunch, and you bring in food, and it's Ramadan, or it's a
Right.
fasting day. That's like, I mean, I love food, but maybe you haven't even thought. So I feel like I'm kind of going on and on, but I think it's thinking about what are you doing in the context of your work that might be communicating to the broader group of people who's valuable, who's not, and how do we include people?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. You've raised so many interesting and compelling points in relation to, particularly in the academy, right? Like how we struggle with the
Yeah,
co-location of positive micro interactions with what seems to be in many places, regrettably, part of its like standard operating practice of participating in microaggressions. And something you said really resonated with me, Michelle, was this idea of kind of giving people a pass to be acerbic, right? Like
yeah,
that's just who they are, and
yes,
to be able to, for someone who doesn't necessarily feel powerful in an organization, right? How are they going to be able to express concerns about that if the person that is perpetuating that behavior has more positional authority or more power than them within, the academy, within higher education? I think a lot about, support staff in various functions. I think a lot about, you had mentioned graduate students and
yeah,
faculty that are often on the tenure track and not yet tenured.
yeah.
And I'm really interested in hearing from you, how or what should the pivot point be for us, those of us who manage and, manage teams. At what point do we help to foster like self advocacy strategies, or what are some of the things that we can really do to help individuals who don't necessarily feel that they have voice, agency, authority, or power within the academy? How can we help them, to address these microaggressions? Because I know for a fact they tend to happen a lot of times outside of the manager's gaze. So we don't see it or hear about it until it has, festered negatively in a way where regrettably we'll end up losing a good team member or some other things will happen. So I'm really interested in hearing, do you have any ideas for us around how can we kind of cut it off at the path if possible?
I think part of it is, yeah, we have to speak up if you have the power, especially if you have tenure, and being
Yes.
willing to speak up. And that I think even people with tenure sometimes, depending on their circumstances, may not feel they have that power, but really looking out for real, okay. So, for example, sometimes I don't feel like I have a ton of power, right? And then I'll
Mm-hmm.
think, wait,
Mm-hmm.
I'll say, Michelle Duffy, you are a tenured professor. You are a full professor.
Right.
You can and should be looking out for your younger colleagues. And one of the ways this came up was broadly for our school was how are we supporting our younger colleagues, or more junior colleagues, I should say, who have just worked through this pandemic on top of
Mm-hmm.
everything else, with young children who are unvaccinated, not able to go places, and advocating for them and being willing to stand up and say, again, this is not a personal problem for them. We are a
Right.
team. They have been struggling. And that if I can just say, like, I want to normalize this, that, yeah, they have children, right? And they
Right.
get
Right.
sick and they miss work and they're struggling and they're anxious and they're worn out. And there's nothing shameful about that.
That's right.
And I think that normalization of saying this is absolutely how we would expect it to be and not a sign of incredible dysfunction, and really having their backs, just even not just emotionally, but in terms of policies. So we just ask
Mm-hmm.
for our junior colleagues to be given extra tenure time. We ask them to have reduced teaching loads as they come off COVID. We've asked them, the university, to, one of the things we ask for grant money to help kind of support and reboost their research. I mean, these are just ideas, but I think that they
Mm-hmm.
could be applied like in different ways, right, to different places. I think I got lost in my thoughts there, but
No,
yeah, yeah,
but they're all good thoughts. No worries.
yeah, yeah,
No, I get it. And you raised another interesting piece that leads into another question for me around how COVID has shifted so much of how the pre-COVID work engagements and work experiences have happened, right? It's really
yeah,
smashed it to smithereens, like some of those incidental occasions through which micro interventions from a positive perspective could happen, like in break rooms or in hallways,
yeah,
have now really been replaced with engagements from afar, using Zoom or Teams or other types of video conferencing technology. So, how can we really ensure that positive micro engagements are incorporated into like everyday work existence? So, like, regardless as to where you work or how you work, what are the ways in which we can strengthen positive micro engagements more? You definitely gave some good ideas around supporting faculty, but I'm really interested in hearing some more. This is really good stuff.
yeah. It's such an interesting question because I have this sense that I hear a lot of people in administrate, like higher up people, they're almost like a panic, or that the workplace is falling apart
Yeah.
because,
Yes.
right, like, and, and I think it's just because it's new, right? And so we have to find new ways of doing things. And I mean, one, just kind of like the answer to my other question, one thing I've been thinking about is, first, let's just start with some acceptance that this is how it is. It's probably how it's going to be
Right.
for a while.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's normal to kind of mourn how things, quote unquote, used to be for some people. But okay, you know what? This is what it is. So let's think about what we can do. And I cannot claim to be an expert on this, but what I've been hearing and thinking about is thinking about different ways of experimenting with, I'll give some specific examples about like what you could do, like in meetings and stuff. But
Mm-hmm.
one thing broadly I've been thinking about is that, all right, so we don't see each other, daily, maybe at the, like in the break room or something. But if we're on Zoom, we are in our homes, right? And
Right.
I actually read a Wall Street Journal opinion piece where the person said it was time to get professional and, you know, make sure our pets weren't in the house, hide all our children
Oh, here we go. Right.
here,
Like,
right?
here we go.
And I thought, how sad, because
Wow.
what I'm thinking is we have an opportunity here that, you know, having a family or a pet or a basement office or a child, that's not unprofessional. That's your humanity, right? And
Yes.
that's how we connect with people. And, if we have time, we can talk about this. But one of the biggest reasons that we have negative interactions is because we see people as outside our circle. And so here,
Yes.
right, we're in our homes. Like, I will tell you that I was in a meeting and someone's cat showed up and I smiled. I was like, I can't believe he has a cat. I have to say, I saw him in a very positive and different way, right? Like the way
Yes.
he looked at his cat. I was like, oh,
Right.
that's a side I didn't see. And so maybe having less panic about this and seeing this remote work, if we're on Zoom, as an opportunity to connect with each other beyond what are we accomplishing, like we would at work. It's just more visual. Connecting with them, asking questions, showing empathy. I think that's one way. Another, though, completely opposite. on this is that there is some research that says that just in terms of like the Zoom or the conferencing on video, that
Yes.
we have this belief that to be engaged, we have to be on camera,
Yeah.
right?
Yes.
Or
Yes.
we're not on camera. And I get it. Like I've given talks where I couldn't see anybody. It does feel a little strange, but what they find is that it's exhausting to be on camera for women in particular,
Mm-hmm.
because there's a lot of pressure around appearance, and you already feel the like I'm the mom or I'm a woman at home, like that's really salient. And so you want to feel like you need to minimize that. For groups
Yes.
with anyone with like lower status in the organization may feel uncomfortable. Maybe their house is different. Whatever it is that, you feel lower power, being on camera. So Dr. Ali Gabriel at Arizona, fabulous research. She found that actually people who in these categories who had their cameras off had more voice, more connection, and more
Mm-hmm.
engagement during meetings, which completely counters the wisdom of we have to keep them
Mm-hmm.
on. So
Right.
I love that. Like if you're thinking about that for people, right? Like, okay, what position are they on? We are not, it's kind of like that thing about what are you hearing? Are you listening? What are you seeing?
Right.
What are you not seeing? Right. And so thinking about that for people, that actually you can have more connection with the cameras off. Um, but then even in things like, okay, so we've had to try to get really creative, and I think there are creative ways that we can use technology. So, for example, there is software that I use sometimes in my meetings where
Mm-hmm.
it's anonymous, which I really like, and I'll ask people like, okay, what are we worried about? Sometimes people don't want to say what
Okay.
they're worried about, and it's really interesting. It'll display on the screen. It could be like a word art, or it could be a bar chart, or just a flow of words, and then this leads to a great discussion because people see what other people are thinking, and they're less afraid to share their own concerns now because it was anonymous at the
Yeah.
beginning.
Yeah. Yeah.
I've done sessions where I ask people to just say, hey, what's a win we had this week? What happened that was good? I've been in meetings where people, and at first it's that thing where you're like, I don't want to do this, but it's where we just went around and we all shared what was going on. And then you picked the next person yourself, right, in the Zoom box. So these are small things.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
My manager sent us for one of our first meetings a box of work stuff for our meeting. And it was like coffee cup with a tea bag. I mean, it's just like really well thought out little things like that. So I do think
Yeah.
I'm definitely not an expert on here. I feel like though if we can keep opening our hearts and our minds to ways in which it, we can still connect. It doesn't have to be the way it was. We can be creative with technology, and we
Right.
can think about how we're using it. Or we could even do, sometimes I take walking meetings now on my phone, right? So I'm walking around, they're
Yeah.
walking around, and we discuss what we need to discuss at work, but it feels like, oh, we're both out for a walk and talking like we used to be. Just, I mean, small things like
Right.
that.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, thank you for that. Because you are indeed an expert in terms of mindfulness at work and this notion of expanding upon our broader understanding around micro interventions. And let me walk backwards to iterate on a couple of things before I ask you the next few questions. So, of course, as you well know, you have more intimacy with the research around micro interactions than I do. But, there was this period pre pandemic of what I called like the sizzle reel on this particular topic. The power of, the big power of small, and kind
Hmm.
of all these things that I felt were more focused on the corporate sector, more focused on, something that you had outlined was kind of this outward projection of self that was very orchestrated, right? And
Right.
so although we were talking at first about, yeah, the you can do incrementalism and small steps and you can do small things and it can have big impact, it was still bound to non-humanistic metrics of productivity, right?
Okay, right.
And there is a lot of pushback I'm starting to see, Michelle, like on the internet and everything else around the so-called code of productivity, how it, in some ways has helped to catalyze the great resignation and the loss of positive micro interactions, right? And so in this grind to quote unquote be more productive, even within COVID, some people are communicating this real sense of loss and this real sense of or a real sense of
Mm,
disconnection to others. And some of the examples that you just shared, I thought were really neat ways that, in spite of technology, there can still be that important human connection to keep us, together and to make us feel as if we're still, in some ways, whole in
yeah,
relationship to others. And I just find that so interesting.
yeah. One, if I can, one thing I came across that I've used, it's work by Dr. Stephanie Creary, and
Mm-hmm.
she's at Wharton, and she has this thing where she says, you know what can I do to connect and develop across relationships? What's one small
Mm-hmm.
thing I can do? And it relates to this feeling, like you were talking about this, like the burnout and the lack of humanity. And so she talks about leaping across boundaries
Mm-hmm.
and really thinking about, okay, first of all, she has, and I've run this where you think about another person that you're paired up with or that you're thinking about, that you can do it at work. It's very easy. And you think about this other person first before you're talking, and you think about where do we share common ground? And it could be really and it should be simple. It should be like, okay, we both like skiing or whatever. We're both in marketing. And then where are we different? Where do I see differences? And then you think about what is one way you think you can help and support that person, and what is
Mm-hmm.
one
Mm-hmm.
way you think they can help and support you. And
Mm-hmm.
then it's about a 15-minute exercise that we do. And it is really powerful. This notion of kind of this leaping across differences, kind of acknowledging, okay, you're in this spot, I'm in this spot. Here's where we're like linked. And with these differences, I actually might be able to help you with something, and you can help me with something. And so we're not only
Mm-hmm.
connected through just humanity, but through our ability to support one another. And I don't know, I love this exercise. I've run it many times. Again, it's not mine, it's Dr. Curry's, but this leaping across boundaries and thinking about what is one thing I can do, and maybe even thinking what
Yeah.
is one thing I can do to support someone else, and how do I think they can
Yeah.
support me? And I kind of like that flip of it, like, because you're not just saying I'm going to help you, right? It's also saying you have something so valuable there too, and that I could really use your help, which sometimes I think can be missing in the ways that we help people.
Oh,
I'm not sure if
yeah,
that
I
answers your
absolutely
question at
agree.
all, but I was, I
No, it
was,
totally did. I mean, it's so many, divergent thoughts kind of swirling in my head as
yes,
I'm listening to you talk. But it's so really interesting that I feel like we're making space in the Academy for Humanity to be brought to the foreground and not suppressed in the background. And
yes,
so much of what you're sharing really makes me joyful. Yet, there's also still the situational reality for so many who are not feeling that humanity is being foregrounded, right? In the
right,
ways in which many of us would like for it to. And I specifically think of, colleagues of color,
yeah,
people who, and I was thinking about something you had said earlier in terms of having cameras off and people being judged on what their Zoom display is within their household, all of those pieces. And while there is definitely the idea of not bringing so much formality to engagements, even within a video conferencing space, people of color are still feeling a lot of professional pressure,
Yeah.
regardless as to where they work. I know you've seen some of the emerging research on this since COVID, so there are the COVID impacts. And then there's still this kind of, as one colleague had identified it to me, Michelle, there's still so-called room rater pressure. Room Raider being this Twitter handle that judges people on their backgrounds, gives
Oh
you
my
like
goodness.
a what?
Yes, I've seen
Yeah,
that.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. It's like you get a 1 to 10, and while they are only rating individuals in the public eye, there are some people who believe that practice has trickled over into the higher education workplace and to other sectors, workplaces where people are judging people's spaces, right?
Right. Right.
And when you were talking about the Wall Street Journal op-ed where it was saying get the cats and the kids out of the room,
Yeah.
to me, I'm like, yeah, there's something there, right? And so I'm really interested in hearing from you, how do we figure out a more humane way to balance that and to kind of stop some of these practices of judgment and to shift them towards positive micro interactions? Because I just think that so many people still are feeling stressed and feeling a need to put on performance, even in a virtual space, a virtual workspace.
Yeah, I think that's a really tough question. It's like so important, and I want to have really great answers. And I'm feeling speaking of pressure, like maybe I don't,
Uh-oh.
but I mean, I think I have. This is something I've thought about too. Like, there's already pressure, and then feeling kind of protective of
Yeah.
your space and personal space. And then one more thing to be judged on is terrible. And my doctoral student actually is doing looking at grief. That is her dissertation topic, and
Mm-hmm.
she specifically looked. No, she was not looking at race. She was looking more, and she was not looking at diversity. She was looking more at loss from, but it could be loss from anything. So it was broader in how grief intrudes into our daily lives through these pangs, these constant
Mm.
reminders. And I think one of the interesting things she found was just how frequent things that may seem tiny, these little reminders or digs that you've either lost something and that loss has somehow made you different, or that you are
Yeah.
different from your colleagues. Um,
Mm-hmm.
and the way that has hurt engagement. And the one thing that she is optimistic about is there is a movement kind of towards, I think there is this I do hear what you're saying on the code of productivity. I see it, that it's like
Yeah.
this, oh, now that we've lost productivity, we somehow superhumanly have to do even more with less. Like this compassion, this need for compassionate responding and compassion in the workplace. But I think one of the problems we're struggling with, if you think about everybody feeling kind of stressed out, you need the people higher up to kind of take their mind a little bit off the bottom line for a little bit.
Yes.
I'm not,
Yes.
I'm not
Mm-hmm.
saying let things, just go, in a handbasket somewhere, but let's take our eye off that and let's think about the people who are working with us, working for us, supporting us in terms of a compassionate lens, and having compassionate responses and recognizing what is going on in people's lives. But I don't know exactly how to get people there, like leaders.
Mm-hmm.
Like that, I feel like I can talk about like leaders stopping abusive practices, but that's a little different. Um,
Yeah.
how do you get people to hear? Even if I think about, I live in Minneapolis, and I mean, I'm not even sure where you live, but probably
Mm-hmm.
Minneapolis seems to be in the news everywhere, in
Yes.
every
Yes.
state. for the high amount of racial injustice and harm, and then going to work for people in that context and not recognizing that people don't leave what's happening out in the world right around them. Like they don't step into work and then that doesn't matter anymore. And I think for
Mm-hmm.
some people, they they don't recognize that grief and pain in their own colleagues. And
Right.
I don't think leadership sometimes realizes there are people that are stuffing their feelings of grief at what
Mm-hmm.
they see around them every day. And we work, we spend most of our time at work if you really think about it.
Right.
And
Yep.
I personally believe like stakeholders, we have always talk about who are stakeholders. I personally believe the stakeholders of the workplace are the community too that you live in. And so
Mm-hmm.
these are your stakeholders, right? And so what are you doing to recognize what's happening? What are you doing to lighten the load for some people? What are you doing to make it okay to take some time off, to have space? I honestly do not have the answers, obviously, but I have, these are just things I've been thinking about and I think it's really challenging.
It is challenging.
Or
It
maybe
is
it's not, we
challenging.
just don't do it. I don't know. That's the other thing. What if it's, I
Well,
mean,
there's that with some individuals too. But my last question really touches on something that I think is so critical, that you struck upon in your last response, Michelle, and that is this idea of compassionate leadership. So, if you could leave us with a definition of what that looks like. How could passionate leadership express itself successfully, in the workplace? I'm really interested in hearing your perspective on that.
I think it is a leader who has the ability to have empathy for the people that are working with them. And as a side note, I would say empathy can be learned. Like yes, we might be born with a little more, but we can learn it. We can learn it through
Yes,
we can learn it through mindfulness even. There are mindfulness
yes.
practices for empathy. It is a leader who is humble in some ways and views their role as supporting people, the people that work for them. So that leader, yes, they care about production, etc., but they also recognize that healthy people are one of the best ways to do that. But beyond that, they have empathy for, excuse me, Alexia, my cat just jumped on my
Oh,
lap.
it's
No,
okay. Speaking of cats,
I
I'm
know.
surprised mine hasn't disrupted the podcast, because that typically happens every time I do a podcast. So,
I mean, of all the irony, he's running around meowing at me.
of
Um,
course.
of course. So, okay, now I'm off track. Yeah. So, okay, empathy, your goal, you have empathy for others. You hear them, and your job as a leader is not to simply tell them what to do, but it is to be supportive and making sure they have what they need. They have the resources they need to do their job. And those resources can
Mm-hmm.
vary. It can be training, yes. But when I think here, I'm really talking about, do they have the emotional resources that they need to do their job? Do they have the interpersonal resources? And if not, why not? And what do I need to do to support that person in the best way I can? And recognizing and expressing. I think the other thing, when we tend to get tight and stressed out in our work lives, I think we stop really appreciating people and thanking them and really recognizing what people are going through, and connecting with them on that. Like, thank you. Like, I know this, something really simple, but we know really simple expressions of gratitude that are not just an email where you're like, thank you, for doing these things, but true expressions where you acknowledge what people have been doing and why it's
Mm-hmm.
made a difference, and recognizing that they've been doing incredible things under tremendous pressure. Um, I'm rambling again, but yes, that is
No,
what
you're
I'm
not.
thinking with compassionate leadership.
Thank you. You were not rambling at all. This was a delightful conversation. Michelle, thank you so much for your time. We
Thank you.
really appreciate it.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Take me down under. Romance me with dream, occupy my mind lifetime.
Thank you for listening to our Toward Inclusive Excellence Spring Semester podcast with Dr. Michelle Duffy, the Vernon Heath Chair in the Department of Work and Organizations in the Carlson School of Management at the University of Minnesota. I encourage you to sign up for reminders of new content releases, sign up for our newsletter, follow us on Twitter and on LinkedIn. Thank you so much for your time and support. Be well.